The wind didn't just howl, it screamed with the metallic tear of a freight train derailing in the pitch black. Outside the frosted glass of Sarah Jenkins' isolated Montana cabin, the world had been erased by a suffocating, lethal white. The temperature had plunged to 45 below zero, freezing the sap in the pine trees until they exploded like gunshot. 10 yards away lay her barn, holding the only livestock keeping her from starvation. A 10-yard walk that would mean instant death in the blinding whiteout. But Sarah wasn't going outside. She was going under. As the roof groaned under feet of snow, Sarah unlatched a heavy oak trapdoor in her floorboards, staring down into the dark, narrow earth. The trench was waiting. Sarah Jenkins was not a woman prone to paranoia. At 42, she had weathered her fair share of storms, both literal and metaphorical. Following the sudden death of her husband, David, a year prior, she had sold their comfortable suburban home in Ohio and purchased a remote, off-grid property nestled deep in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. The land was rugged, beautiful, and completely unforgiving. It came with a sturdy log cabin, a sprawling, weathered barn, and 70 acres of dense pine forest. Her nearest neighbor, a pragmatic cattle rancher named Caleb Foster, lived 8 miles down a dirt road that washed out every spring. It was mid-September when the shift in the atmosphere began. The air, usually crisp and fragrant with pine at that time of year, held a heavy, metallic stillness. The local wildlife had vanished. The deer weren't grazing in her lower pasture, and the usual chorus of coyotes had fallen dead silent. The idea for the trench didn't come to Sarah in a dream. Bill was a fixture at Mitchell's Hardware in town, an octogenarian with skin like cured leather and a mind sharp as a hunting knife. Sarah had gone into town to stock up on winter feed for her 3 goats, a dozen Rhode Island red chickens, and an aging draft horse named Buster. As she loaded 50-pound sacks of oats into the bed of her Ford F-150, Bill had shuffled over, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. "You're the widow who bought the old Pendleton place up on Ridge Creek, aren't you?" Bill had asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. Sarah nodded, wiping sweat from her forehead. "That's right. Sarah Jenkins." Bill looked past her, his milky blue eyes scanning the clear, cloudless sky. "Animals are gone," he muttered. "Caterpillars are completely black this year. Pine cones fell a month early. You got a lot of space between your front door and that barn, Mrs. Jenkins?" "About 30 feet," Sarah replied, puzzled. "Pendleton lost half his toes trying to make that 30-foot walk in the winter of '78, Bill said, his gaze snapping back to her. Storm came in off the divide. 3 weeks of whiteout. The snow didn't just drift. It swallowed the world. If you can't get to the barn, your animals die. If you try to get to the barn in a whiteout, you die. Dig a trench. Cover it. Or you won't be coming down this mountain come spring." Most people would have written Bill off as an eccentric old man prone to exaggeration. But David's death had taught Sarah a brutal lesson about the fragility of life and the arrogance of assuming tomorrow would be normal. She drove back to Ridge Creek with a gnawing pit in her stomach. She spent that evening measuring the distance between the cabin's raised crawl space and the side entrance of the barn. 32 feet. The next morning, she didn't tend to the garden or chop firewood. She drove back into town and rented a compact Kubota backhoe. For the next 3 weeks, Sarah dug. The work was agonizing. The topsoil was shallow, giving way quickly to dense, rocky clay that jarred her teeth every time the backhoe's bucket struck a buried boulder. She dug a trench 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep, carving a jagged scar straight through her front yard. When the backhoe couldn't maneuver close enough to the cabin's foundation, or the barn's stone footings, she used a pickaxe and a shovel. Her hands blossomed with blisters that popped, bled, and turned into thick yellow calluses. Her back ached with a persistent, fiery throb, but a strange, primal urgency drove her forward. Caleb Foster drove up her driveway one afternoon in early October, his truck kicking up a cloud of dust. He stepped out, pushing his Stetson back on his head, staring in bewilderment at the massive ditch. "Sarah," What in God's name are you doing? Caleb asked, stepping carefully to the edge of the trench. You putting in a new septic line? A covered walkway, Sarah grunted, throwing a spade full of heavy clay over her shoulder. For the winter, Caleb chuckled, a sound devoid of malice, but full of patronizing amusement. A walkway? Sarah, it snows here. Sure. Sometimes we get a few feet. You just bundle up and shovel a path. You're tearing up your whole yard. Bill Harrison mentioned the winter of 78, Sarah said, pausing to lean on her shovel. She looked up at Caleb, her face smeared with dirt, her eyes deadly serious. Caleb's smile faltered slightly, a shadow passing over his face. Bill is an old man with too many ghost stories. The 78 storm was a freak, 100-year event. You're exhausting yourself for a ghost, Sarah. Maybe, she said, turning back to the earth. But I'm digging it anyway. By late October, the trench was fully excavated. She reinforced the earthen walls with thick, pressure-treated timber, driving heavy wooden stakes deep into the ground to prevent the sides from collapsing under the weight of future snow. Over the top, she laid thick, heavy-duty corrugated steel panels, securing them to the wooden frame. Finally, she used the backhoe to cover the steel roof with 2 feet of the excavated dirt, effectively burying the structure. From the surface, it looked like a strange, raised earthen mound connecting the cabin to the barn. Inside the cabin, she sawed through the floorboards of her mudroom, building a sturdy wooden ladder that descended into the dark tunnel. She did the same in the tack room of the barn. She strung up a series of battery-powered LED camping lights along the timber walls of the trench. When it was finished, she stood in the subterranean hallway. It smelled intensely of raw earth, cut pine, and cold. It was claustrophobic, measuring only wide enough for her to walk comfortably with a bucket in each hand. But it was solid. She returned the backhoe on November 1st. 2 days later, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. The barometer in Sarah's kitchen didn't just drop. It plummeted. The needle rested lower than she had ever seen it, hovering in a zone that simply indicated severe. The eerie stillness that had plagued the mountain for weeks was suddenly shattered. It started not with snow, but with wind. It came howling over the jagged peaks of the Bitterroots, sweeping down through the pines with terrifying velocity. The ancient trees surrounding Sarah's clearing swayed violently, their trunks groaning in protest. Inside the cabin, Sarah rushed from room to room, securing the heavy wooden storm shutters she had installed over the windows. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a matter of hours, taking the air from a brisk 30 degrees to a bone-chilling 10. Then, the snow began. It wasn't the large, lazy, picturesque flakes of a holiday movie. It was fine, hard, and granular, driven completely horizontal by the gale-force winds. It sounded like sand blasting against the log walls of the cabin. Within the first hour, the ground was covered. By nightfall, the drifts against the north face of the cabin were already 3 feet high. Sarah sat by her cast-iron wood stove, nursing a mug of black coffee, watching the fire dance behind the glass. The noise outside was deafening. It sounded like a jet engine roaring continuously in her front yard. The cabin drafts, previously unnoticeable, became icy daggers slicing through the chinking in the logs. She piled on a thick wool sweater over her thermal shirt and wrapped a heavy blanket around her shoulders. She tried to turn on the radio to catch a weather broadcast from Missoula, but the station was dead. Just a thick, aggressive wall of static. The power grid had failed just past sunset, plunging the cabin into darkness save for the glow of the wood stove and a single kerosene lantern on the kitchen table. She walked to the front door and placed her hand against the thick oak. It was freezing to the touch. The wind battered the door so fiercely she could feel the wood vibrating. Curiosity and a touch of dread pushed her to slide the heavy iron deadbolt back and pull the door open just a crack. The force of the wind nearly ripped the handle from her grip. A blinding slurry of white ice and snow blasted into her face, stinging her skin like a swarm of angry hornets. She couldn't see the trees 10 feet away. She couldn't see the sky, and, most terrifyingly, she couldn't see the barn, where the massive, two-story structure should have loomed just 30 feet away. There was only a chaotic vortex of white. The air was so violently cold it sucked the breath straight from her lungs, causing her chest to seize. Panic flared in her chest. She slammed the door shut, throwing her entire body weight against it to engage the deadbolt again. She stood there panting, snow melting on her face and pooling on the hardwood floor. Bill Harrison had been right. It wasn't just a storm. It was an erasure. If she had not dug the trench, she realized with a sickening lurch of her stomach, Buster, the goats, and the chickens would be completely on their own. And eventually, they would die. The temperature was forecasted to drop to 40 below zero overnight, without fresh water, which would freeze in their troughs within hours, and without the heavy blankets she needed to strap onto the horse, they wouldn't survive. And if she had tried to carry buckets of water through that maelstrom, she would have lost her sense of direction in seconds. She would have frozen to death, less than a dozen yards from her own front porch. The reality of her isolation settled over her like a heavy, suffocating shroud. Caleb was miles away, likely fighting his own battle to keep his cattle alive. The county plow trucks wouldn't come up Ridge Creek during a whiteout. It was suicide for the drivers. She was entirely, profoundly alone. She checked her watch. It was 6 a.m. It was time for the morning feed. Sarah walked into the mudroom. The air in this unheated part of the cabin was brutally cold. She pulled on her insulated Carhartt bib overalls, a thick down parka, a heavy wool balaclava, and thick leather work gloves. She grabbed 2 empty galvanized steel buckets. She knelt on the floor and grabbed the iron ring attached to the heavy trapdoor she had built into the floorboards. With a grunt of exertion, she hauled it open. A draft of air rose from the dark hole. It wasn't warm, but compared to the freezing ambient temperature of the mudroom, it felt remarkably temperate. The earth, buried deep below the frost line and insulated by the snow above, held a steady, cool temperature. She clicked on her heavy-duty flashlight, shining the beam down the wooden ladder into the narrow, timber-lined tunnel. The dirt walls swallowed the light, making the trench look like the throat of some subterranean beast. Sarah took a deep breath, gripped the handles of her buckets, and stepped down onto the first rung. The transition from the cabin to the trench was jarring. As Sarah descended the wooden ladder and pulled the trapdoor shut above her, the deafening roar of the blizzard was instantly muffled. The screaming wind became a low, distant thrum, a vibration she felt in her chest more than she heard with her ears. The silence down here was thick, heavy, and ancient. She reached out and flicked the switch for the battery-powered LED lights. A sequence of pale white circles illuminated the narrow passageway. The trench was exactly as she had left it. The rough-hewn timber beams supporting the walls looked strong, though the dampness of the earth had already begun to darken the wood. Condensation beaded on the corrugated steel roof directly above her head. The air was dense, smelling richly of wet clay, old pine, and the faint, metallic tang of the steel roofing. It triggered a sudden, sharp spike of claustrophobia. Sarah had to close her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to breathe slowly through her nose. 4 feet wide, 6 feet deep, 32 feet long. She mentally recited the dimensions to ground herself. She was not buried alive. She was traversing a bridge. She stepped off the ladder, her heavy winter boots sinking slightly into the packed dirt floor. Carrying the 2 steel buckets, she began the walk. It was a strange, surreal journey. Every few steps, she paused, listening. The dirt walls seemed to press in on her, and the ceiling, only inches above her insulated hat, felt impossibly heavy. She knew that above the steel panels, feet of snow were rapidly accumulating, adding thousands of pounds of pressure to her makeshift roof. She watched the timber support posts carefully. None of them were bowing. Her workmanship was holding up. Halfway down the trench, the temperature noticeably shifted. It grew slightly warmer, carrying the distinct, musky scent of hay, manure, and animal sweat. She was nearing the barn. She reached the end of the tunnel, where a second wooden ladder led up to the floorboards of the barn's tack room. She set her buckets down and climbed the rungs, pushing hard against the wooden trapdoor. It didn't budge. A spike of raw panic hit her. Had the barn collapsed? Had the snow drifted so heavily inside that it blocked the door? She braced her shoulders against the rough wood, dug her boots into the ladder rungs, and shoved with all her leg strength. With a loud creak, the trapdoor popped open, showering her face with dust and a few stray oats. The door hadn't been blocked. The wood had just swollen from the sudden drop in temperature. Sarah scrambled up into the dark tack room. The noise of the storm returned, though it was muffled by the thick, century-old timber walls of the barn. The massive structure was groaning loudly, the wind hammering against its broad side like massive, invisible fists. She grabbed her flashlight and pushed open the door to the main stalls. The animals were in a state of terror. The 3 goats were huddled together in the corner of their pen, bleating nervously. The chickens had abandoned their roosts and were clustered tightly in nesting boxes. Buster, the massive draft horse, was pacing his stall, his hooves thudding heavily against the wood, his eyes wide and white-rimmed in the beam of her flashlight. Hey, it's all right, big guy," Sarah soothed, keeping her voice low and calm despite her own racing heart. She quickly moved to Buster's stall, slipping a heavy, insulated winter blanket over his broad back and fastening the buckles. The horse snorted, burying his velvet nose into her chest, seeking comfort. She worked efficiently in the freezing dark. She used a heavy iron bar to break the thick layer of ice that had already formed over their water troughs. She carried hay from the loft, a treacherous task in the dark as the barn swayed in the wind, and distributed it generously. The act of eating calmed the animals, their chewing creating a comforting, rhythmic sound against the backdrop of the howling storm. After an hour of back-breaking labor, securing the barn doors from the inside, and ensuring every animal was fed, watered, and blanketed, Sarah felt a profound wave of exhaustion wash over her. Her muscles screamed, and her fingers were numb despite the thick gloves. It was time to go back to the cabin. She descended back into the tack room, climbed down the ladder, and pulled the trapdoor shut, plunging herself back into the muffled, subterranean world of the trench. She flicked the LED lights back on and picked up her empty buckets. She was halfway down the 32-foot tunnel, the adrenaline fading into deep fatigue, when she stopped dead in her tracks. The low thrum of the blizzard was still there, a constant vibration. But over it, cutting through the heavy layer of frozen earth and corrugated steel above her head, she heard something else. Crunch. It was heavy, deliberate. Crunch! Sarah held her breath, her eyes darting to the ceiling. The snow up there was likely 3 feet deep by now. A human couldn't possibly be walking around out there in a whiteout at 40 below zero. Crunch. Creak. The sound was directly overhead now. It was immense. The thick timber support post nearest to her suddenly groaned, a fine dusting of dirt sifting down from the ceiling to land on her shoulder. Whatever was up there, walking blindly through the lethal blizzard directly over her trench, was incredibly large, and it was pacing. The sound directly above the trench was not the chaotic, rhythmic thud of a falling tree or the shifting weight of settling snow. It was a calculated, heavy pressure. Crunch. Squeak. Crunch. Sarah froze on the dirt floor, her hand instinctively reaching out to brace against the rough bark of a timber support post. The LED lights strung along the ceiling cast long, dancing shadows as the heavy corrugated steel roof groaned under the localized weight. The snowpack above was already immense, but this new pressure was distinct. It was moving toward the barn. She turned off her flashlight, plunging the trench into the dim, artificial glow of the string lights. Her breath plumed in the freezing air, rapid and shallow. She knew the wildlife in the bitter roots. A mountain lion would be too light to make the thick steel buckle like that. A stray cow from Caleb Foster's ranch would have bogged down and frozen in the 10-foot drifts long before reaching her property. A low, vibrating snuffle filtered through the layers of frozen earth and metal. It was a deep, wet exhalation that sent a primal spike of adrenaline straight into Sarah's bloodstream. It was a grizzly, the bizarre, extended autumn, and the sudden, violent plunge into sub-zero temperatures had caught the ecosystem off guard. The bears, usually deep in torpor by November, had been starved by the early drop of pine nuts and the disappearance of the deer. This was a massive male, desperate, starving, and driven mad by the blinding whiteout, and it could smell the rich, warm scent of Buster, the goats, and the chickens venting from the barn's roof. Right now, it was walking the exact path of her buried trench, instinctively following the faint geothermal heat leaking up from the subterranean tunnel. Directly above Sarah, the heavy footfalls stopped. The steel ceiling gave a sharp, metallic pop that echoed down the dirt hallway like a gunshot. The bear had caught her scent through the layered earth. Then, the digging began. It started as a frantic, heavy scraping. The massive claws tore through the compacted snow and ice with terrifying speed. Sarah backed away, her boots slipping on the loose dirt. She watched in horror as the ceiling began to vibrate violently. Dirt began to rain down in thick sheets between the overlapping panels of the corrugated steel. "It's going to break through," her mind screamed. The timber supports were rated for static weight, the slow, even pressure of snow and dirt. They were not designed to withstand a 1,000-pound apex predator violently excavating the roof. Sarah dropped her empty buckets. They clattered against each other, the sound magnified in the narrow space. Above, the digging paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed with doubled ferocity, accompanied by a guttural, frustrated roar that vibrated the very fillings in Sarah's teeth. She couldn't stay in the trench. If the roof collapsed, she would be buried alive under tons of freezing mud, snow, and a starving grizzly. She sprinted for the cabin. The 30 feet felt like a mile. She scrambled up the wooden ladder, her shins banging painfully against the rungs, and heaved the heavy oak trapdoor open. She threw herself onto the mudroom floor, slamming the door shut beneath her and throwing the heavy iron latch she had installed just days prior. She lay on the cold hardwood, her chest heaving, listening to the muffled, distant sounds of the storm and the terrifying scraping beneath the floorboards of the yard. She dragged a heavy oak workbench over the trapdoor for good measure, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the wood. For the next 10 hours, Sarah sat by the wood stove with her husband David's old Winchester, 30-30 rifle across her lap. She didn't sleep. The temperature outside plummeted to 48 below zero. The wind continued its relentless, screaming assault against the cabin walls. Every creak of the logs, every shift in the foundation, made her jump. By mid-afternoon of the second day, the scraping had stopped. The sheer brutality of the blizzard had likely forced the bear to abandon the excavation and seek shelter, or perhaps the frozen clay beneath the snowpack had proven too solid even for its 4-inch claws. But the silence brought no comfort. Sarah was effectively trapped in the cabin. The animals in the barn had been without fresh water or hay for nearly 18 hours. She had to go back down. Day 5 of the storm brought a new kind of terror: the silence of the snow. The wind had finally died, leaving behind an alien landscape. From the heavily frosted slits of her second-story windows, Sarah looked out at a world completely devoid of definition. The terrain of Ridge Creek had been smoothed over by a staggering 12 feet of accumulated snow. The barn was buried up to its second-story hayloft doors. The world was a blinding, suffocating white ocean. Inside the cabin, survival had become a brutal, calculated mathematical equation. She was burning through her seasoned firewood faster than anticipated. The temperature in the main living area hovered at a barely tolerable 45 degrees, while the edges of the room were coated in a thin layer of hoarfrost. But the real crisis was the trench. Descending the ladder that morning, Sarah immediately smelled the change. The familiar scent of damp earth was overpowered by the sharp, acrid smell of freshly split pine. She clicked on her flashlight, sweeping the beam down the narrow tunnel. About 10 feet in, exactly where the grizzly had attempted to dig 3 days prior, the structural integrity of her liftoff had failed. The heavy, pressure-treated crossbeam spanning the ceiling had splintered. A massive, jagged crack ran down its center, the wood fibers groaning under the impossible weight of the displaced earth. The ruined steel panels, and 12 feet of dense, packed snow. The left vertical support post was bowing inward at a sickening angle. A steady stream of icy mud was leaking through a gap in the steel, forming a frozen mound on the tunnel floor. If that crossbeam snapped, the entire middle section of the trench would instantly cave in, severing her connection to the barn permanently. "Okay, Sarah. Think," she whispered aloud, her voice trembling in the freezing, confined space. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She needed to shore up the failing timber, and she needed to do it immediately. She navigated carefully past the buckling section, pressing her back against the opposite dirt wall, terrified that her mere presence would be the vibration that triggered the collapse. She made it to the barn, her heart hammering against her ribs. Inside the tack room, she desperately searched for materials. She found 2 8-foot lengths of heavy steel piping left behind by the previous owner, a 4x4 wooden fence post, and a heavy-duty hydraulic car jack. It took her 3 agonizing trips back and forth through the dangerous section of the tunnel to drag the heavy materials into place. The space was too cramped to swing a sledgehammer. She had to rely on leverage and raw, desperate strength. She positioned the 4x4 post vertically under the cracking crossbeam, resting the bottom on the thick steel base plate of the hydraulic jack. Laying on her back in the freezing mud, the air so cold it burned her lungs with every inhalation, she began to pump the jack handle. Click. Hiss. Click. Hiss. Slowly. Agonizingly. The vertical post rose, pressing against the splintering ceiling beam. The wood screamed in protest, a terrifying sound that echoed like a dying animal in the dark tunnel. Dirt rained down onto Sarah's face, getting into her eyes and grinding between her teeth. She needed to raise the beam just enough to slide the steel piping alongside the bowing vertical post to brace it. Click. Hiss. Suddenly, the earth shifted. The sudden change in load distribution caused the compromised dirt wall to her left to buckle. A heavy, frozen slab of clay and rock sloughed off the wall, slamming directly into Sarah's right leg. She screamed, the sound echoing harshly off the corrugated roof. The pain was instantaneous and blinding, a sharp, crushing agony just below her knee. She tried to pull her leg free, but the heavy slab of frozen earth, weighing easily 200 pounds, had her pinned against the side of the jack. "Help!" she yelled out instinctively, before the cruel reality of her isolation choked the word off in her throat. Caleb Foster wasn't coming. Nobody was coming. She was buried under the earth, beneath 12 feet of snow, miles from another human being. She lay there panting, her breath creating thick clouds of white vapor. The pain in her leg was a throbbing, radiant heat in the freezing darkness. She looked up at the ceiling. The heavy crossbeam was temporarily supported by the jack, but the entire structure was precariously unbalanced. If she passed out from the pain or the cold down here, she would die. Gritting her teeth so hard she felt a molar crack. Sarah reached out with her heavily gloved hands and clawed at the frozen slab of earth trapping her leg. Her fingers slipped uselessly against the ice and clay. She needed leverage. She grabbed the heavy iron handle of the hydraulic jack, detached it, and jammed the wedged end under the frozen boulder. With a scream of pure, desperate exertion, she threw her entire upper body weight onto the iron bar. The frozen slab groaned, shifted an inch, and rolled heavily off her shin. Sarah scrambled backward, dragging her injured leg, gasping for air. Her heavy Carhartt pants were torn, and she could feel the warm, sticky flow of blood soaking through her thermal underwear. But her leg wasn't broken. She could still move her ankle, though the agony was profound. She couldn't stop. The bracing wasn't finished. Ignoring the nausea rolling through her stomach from the pain, she dragged herself back to the jack. She grabbed the heavy steel piping and wedged it violently into the dirt floor, leaning it tightly against the bowing timber support. She used thick lengths of baling twine, pulling them tight with her teeth and bleeding hands to lash the steel brace to the wooden post. When she finally released the pressure on the hydraulic jack, the wood groaned one final time, settled heavily onto the new steel supports, and held. Sarah collapsed onto the muddy floor of the trench, her chest heaving, her right leg burning with white-hot pain. She looked at the improvised, ugly bracing in the dim LED light. It wasn't permanent, but it would hold the weight. The artery to the barn was still open. She dragged herself the rest of the way down the tunnel to feed the screaming, hungry animals, leaving a dark, smeared trail of blood in the Montana dirt behind her. The journey back up the ladder and into the cabin was a blur of agonizing, red-hot fragments. Sarah hauled herself out of the trapdoor, her right leg dragging behind her like a dead, heavy log. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor of the mudroom, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that tasted of copper and panic. She lay there for 10 minutes, listening to the relentless shriek of the wind before the cold forced her to move. The adrenaline was rapidly leaching from her system, replaced by a deep, nauseating throbbing in her shin. She dragged herself into the kitchen, leaving a trail of muddy, rust-colored smears across the floorboards. Beside the cast-iron wood stove, she kept a heavy plastic first aid kit. She pulled off her heavy winter boots, her hands shaking violently, and used a pair of trauma shears to cut away the blood-soaked thermal underwear clinging to her leg. The wound was ugly. The frozen slab of clay had acted like a blunt axe, tearing a jagged 4-inch gash through her skin and muscle, just missing the bone. The edges were embedded with grit and dark earth from the trench floor. "Okay, Sarah," she whispered, her voice cracking in the empty cabin. "You can't afford an infection." She poured a bottle of sterile saline over the wound, biting down on a rolled-up leather work glove to stifle her screams. The pain was blinding, a brilliant white flash behind her eyes. She used tweezers to painstakingly pick out the pieces of gravel and clay, her vision swimming with dizziness. She doused the laceration in iodine, the chemical burn nearly causing her to black out, and then pulled the jagged edges together with 5 butterfly bandages before wrapping it tightly in sterile gauze. She dragged herself to the battered corduroy sofa near the stove, piling 3 heavy wool blankets over her shivering body. She swallowed 4 ibuprofen and stared at the ceiling, listening to the groans of the cabin as it fought the blizzard. By the 7th day of the whiteout, the storm's fury had somewhat abated, but the damage was done. The cabin was entombed. The windows were entirely blocked by snow, turning day and night into a perpetual, dim twilight. The only light came from the flickering flames of the wood stove and the dying batteries of her flashlights. And then, the fever began. It started as a deep, bone-rattling chill that the fire couldn't touch. Then came the sweats, soaking through her layers of clothing. The wound on her leg was radiating heat, the skin around the bandages swollen, tight, and angry red. Despite her brutal cleaning, the dirt of the trench had carried bacteria deep into the torn muscle. Her mind began to slip its moorings. She caught herself having whispered conversations with David, her late husband, looking over at his empty armchair as if he was sitting there, analyzing the storm data like he used to do back in Ohio. "It's just the low-pressure system, Dave," she muttered, shivering violently under the blankets. "It'll pass," Bill Harrison said. She trailed off, losing her train of thought, but the animals still needed her. The twice-daily trek through the subterranean tunnel became a descent into a localized hell. Pushing open the trapdoor felt like lifting a bank vault. Limping down the wooden ladder sent spikes of agony shooting up her hip. The trench, once her brilliant salvation, now felt like a damp, freezing tomb. The smell of the wet earth, previously just a nuisance, now triggered intense waves of nausea. The temporary bracing, she had erected the hydraulic jack, the steel piping, The lashed 4x4 loomed in the dim LED light like a skeletal sentinel. Every time she passed beneath it, she held her breath, waiting for the splintered crossbeam to finally give way and crush her. Down in the barn, the animals were growing restless and agitated. The damp cold was seeping into their bones. Buster paced relentlessly, his breath blowing thick white clouds. Sarah moved with agonizing slowness, dragging buckets of feed and breaking the ice in their troughs with a heavy hammer, every strike sending a jolt of pain through her infected leg. On the morning of the 9th day, Sarah sat against the wall of Buster's stall, too exhausted to stand. Her temperature was soaring. She pulled out a small, emergency crank radio from her parka pocket. She had tried it every day with no success. But today, driven by a desperate, feverish need for a human voice, she cranked the handle for 2 solid minutes and hit the power switch. Through the heavy wall of static, a faint, rhythmic crackle emerged. She pressed the speaker to her ear, her heart hammering against her ribs. Repeat. State of emergency remains in effect for all of Bitterroot County. It was a voice, a real human voice. It belonged to dispatcher Helen Vance at the county sheriff's office, a woman Sarah had met only once while registering her truck. Sheriff Miller advises all residents to shelter in place. County roads, including Ridge Creek, Blackwood, and impassable. Aerial surveys confirm drifts exceeding 15 feet. Do not attempt to travel. National Guard assets are staging in Missoula, but weather conditions preventing airlifts. The static swelled, swallowing Helen's voice. Sarah let the radio drop into her lap. 15 feet. Ridge Creek was impassable. There would be no snowplows. There would be no Caleb Foster driving his heavy-duty tractor up her driveway to check on her. The National Guard was grounded. She was entirely on her own, nursing a severe infection, buried under a sea of white. And then, the barn began to scream. It wasn't a sudden crack. It was a prolonged, agonizing tear of ancient timber. Sarah snapped her head up, the feverish fog momentarily blasted away by pure adrenaline. The sound came from high above her, in the cavernous, pitch-black space of the hayloft. The barn, built in the late 1920s, had weathered nearly a century of Montana winters. But it had never faced a localized snow load of this magnitude. 12 to 15 feet of dense, wet snow pressing down on the pitched roof equated to tens of thousands of pounds of pressure. Crack boom. A heavy dusting of ancient hay, dust, and dried pigeon droppings rained down from the slatted ceiling above Buster's stall. The massive horse reared back, screaming in terror, his front hooves violently kicking the wooden stall door. The goats began to bleat frantically, a high-pitched, panicked chorus. No, 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 Sarah breathed, forcing herself upright. She leaned heavily against the wooden beams, grabbing her flashlight and pointing it upward. Through the gaps in the loft floorboards, she could see the massive, hand-hewn central ridge beam of the roof bowing dangerously downward. The structural integrity was failing. It wasn't just the roof. The immense lateral pressure of the snowdrifts piled against the north exterior wall was pushing the entire structure off its stone foundation. If the roof collapsed, the hayloft would crash down onto the main floor, instantly crushing Buster, the goats, the chickens, and Sarah herself. She had to get them out. But out to where? The yard above was a lethal, impassable ocean of snow. Opening the main barn doors would just let a 10-foot wall of frozen white cascade into the building, suffocating them. Her eyes darted wildly around the dim, dusty space, finally landing on the open trapdoor in the tackroom floor. The trench. It was 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep. It was claustrophobic, and the middle section was precariously braced with a car jack, but it was reinforced by the earth itself. It was the only space on the property not currently buckling under the weight of the sky. "Come on," Sarah yelled, her voice hoarse and raw. She limped to the goat pen, unlatching the gate. "Go! Get out!" she shooed them. The 3 goats, sensing the imminent structural failure above, didn't need much convincing. They scrambled out of the pen. Sarah guided them toward the tack room, herding them down the wooden ladder. Goats were nimble. They practically slid down the rungs into the dark, earthy tunnel. The chickens were next. She couldn't carry them all. She grabbed the two largest feed sacks she had, dumped the remaining oats onto the floor, and began frantically stuffing the squawking, panicked birds into the heavy burlap, tying the tops loosely so they could breathe. She dropped the sacks down the trapdoor, hearing the soft thuds as they landed on the dirt floor of the trench. Then came the real challenge. Buster. The draft horse weighed 2,000 pounds. He was terrified, his eyes rolling white, his massive body trembling violently. The roof gave another sickening groan, shedding a massive piece of splintered rafter that smashed onto the floor just 5 feet from the stall. "Buster! Hey! Look at me!" Sarah pleaded, grabbing his halter. She slipped a lead rope onto him. "We have to go. Now." She pulled the heavy door open. Buster balked, planting his massive hooves, refusing to step out of the perceived safety of his stall. "Move!" Sarah screamed, slapping his heavy flank. He lunged forward, nearly knocking her over. She led him into the tack room. The horse looked at the small, dark square hole in the floorboards and snorted violently, pulling back against the lead rope. There was no ladder design that could hold him, and the drop was 6 feet into a narrow dirt corridor. Creak snap. The north wall of the barn began to buckle inward. The timber supports snapped like dry twigs, and a massive slab of frozen snow burst through the exterior siding, cascading onto the main floor like an avalanche. There was no time for gentle persuasion. Sarah grabbed a heavy winter horse blanket and threw it over Buster's head, blindfolding him. She tied it off quickly under his jaw. She backed down the ladder, standing on the dirt floor of the trench, looking up at the massive, blindfolded beast hovering over the hole. "Buster, come!" she yelled, yanking down on the heavy lead rope with all her remaining strength. The horse, blinded and terrified by the deafening roar of the collapsing wall behind him, stepped forward. His massive front hooves slipped off the edge of the floorboards. With a squeal of panic, 2,000 pounds of horseflesh plummeted through the trapdoor. Sarah threw herself backward into the mud just as Buster crashed into the trench. The impact shook the earthen walls. The horse landed heavily on his front knees, his hindquarters scraping violently against the edges of the wooden trapdoor opening. He thrashed in the narrow space, his hooves kicking up clumps of clay, his massive body wedged tightly against the timber supports of the tunnel. Above them, the barn finally surrendered. With a deafening, thunderous roar that vibrated deep into Sarah's chest, the main ridge beam snapped. The entire roof, carrying tens of thousands of pounds of snow, collapsed inward. The heavy floorboards of the tack room above them shattered, raining debris, dust, and thick clumps of snow down into the trapdoor opening. Then, total silence. Sarah lay in the freezing mud of the trench, gasping for air, her flashlight dead from the impact. She lay in absolute darkness. Her leg was burning with a fiery, infectious heat. Next to her, in the pitch black, she heard the heavy, rhythmic snorting of the horse. Buster had survived the fall. The goats were bleating softly further down the tunnel towards the cabin. The barn was gone. The yard was impassable. But down here, buried deep beneath the frozen earth, the artery held. Sarah closed her eyes, the fever finally pulling her under, wrapping her in a dark, exhausted unconsciousness. She had saved them. Now, she just had to survive the trench. Consciousness returned to Sarah Jenkins, not as a sudden awakening, but as a slow, agonizing crawl out of a suffocating black ocean. The fever had baked the moisture from her body, leaving her mouth tasting of old pennies and dry dust. She opened her eyes, but the absolute darkness of the trench remained unbroken. The batteries in her headlamp and the strung LED lights had finally died. She was lying on the damp, freezing earth. Beside her, the massive rhythmic breathing of Buster the draft horse acted as a bizarre, organic metronome. The horse shifted his weight, his heavy hoof squelching in the mud mere inches from her face. "Easy, boy," Sarah rasped. Her voice sounded like dry leaves scraping across a driveway. She tried to push herself up, but the moment she moved her right leg, a sickening wave of nausea rolled through her. The infection had spread. Her shin felt as though it had been packed with hot coals, the skin stretched so tight it threatened to split the bandages. She reached down with a trembling, gloved hand and felt her thigh. The lymph nodes in her groin were swollen and hard to the touch. The bacteria from the Montana clay had entered her bloodstream. Sepsis was setting in. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the fever fog. If the infection reached her heart, she would die in this buried tunnel, and the animals would slowly starve alongside her corpse. She needed light, and she needed medicine. Sarah remembered the heavy plastic veterinary tackle box she had dragged down into the trench days ago when she first moved the emergency supplies. It was somewhere near the middle of the tunnel, just past the improvised hydraulic jack brace. She rolled onto her stomach, digging her elbows into the mud. Dragging her dead, burning leg behind her, she began the agonizing crawl. The trench, once a simple 32-foot walk, had become an impossible mountain. Every inch cost her a gasp of breath. She bumped into the soft, woolly side of one of her goats. "Move, Clementine," she whispered, nudging the animal aside. Her hands swept blindly through the mud and scattered hay until her knuckles cracked against hard, cold plastic. The tackle box. Her frozen, clumsy fingers fumbled with the metal latches. She threw the lid open and blindly rummaged through the contents until she found a thick, cylindrical plastic flashlight. She clicked the button. The harsh, white beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the surreal horror of her situation. The trench looked like the belly of a trapped submarine. The dirt walls were weeping muddy water. Buster was wedged near the collapsed barn entrance, his massive head lowered, his coat matted with sweat and dirt. The 3 goats were huddled against the steel bracing. The chickens, having escaped their burlap sacks, were perched nervously on the splintering timber crossbeams. Sarah turned the light onto her own leg. The heavy Carhartt fabric was soaked through with a foul-smelling, yellowish-brown discharge. She dug back into the veterinary box. She pushed aside the hoof picks, the wraps, and the worming paste, her fingers closing around a cold glass vial and a sealed plastic syringe. Penicillin G Procaine. It was veterinary-grade antibiotic, meant for a 2,000-pound draft horse or a sick calf. It was thick, cloudy, and explicitly labelled, "For animal use only." Sarah slumped against the dirt wall, her breathing shallow and rapid. She was a former high school biology teacher, not a doctor. She knew the active compound was the same as human antibiotics, but the suspension fluid, the purity, and the dosage were wild cards. If she miscalculated, the massive dose could send her into anaphylactic shock or shut down her kidneys. If she did nothing, the sepsis would kill her within 24 hours. "Calculated risks, Dave," she muttered, speaking to the ghost of her husband as a fresh wave of fever-induced delirium washed over her. Just like the mortgage. She wiped the rubber stopper of the vial with a filthy alcohol prep pad. She drew back the plunger on the large-gauge veterinary syringe, inserting the thick needle and pulling out a highly estimated, desperately conservative dose, about 4 cubic centimeters of the thick white liquid. She didn't have the strength to remove her heavy winter gear to find a clean injection site. She rolled up the heavy sleeve of her thermal shirt, exposing her pale, freezing shoulder. She wiped the skin with iodine, bit down hard on the collar of her jacket, and plunged the thick needle deep into her deltoid muscle. The heavy suspension fluid burned like liquid fire as she pushed the plunger down. Sarah screamed, the sound muffled by the thick earth surrounding them. She dropped the syringe into the mud and collapsed backward, her body racked with violent, uncontrollable shivering. For the next 2 days, the trench existed outside of time. Sarah slipped in and out of consciousness, caught in vivid, terrifying hallucinations. She saw the grizzly bear pacing above them, its massive claws dripping with blood. She saw Caleb Foster standing at the end of the tunnel, shaking his head in disappointment. But survival is a primal, deeply ingrained instinct. In her brief moments of lucidity, the routine kept her tethered to reality. She dragged herself through the mud to pack empty buckets with the dense snow that had tumbled down from the barn's collapse. She placed the buckets near Buster, allowing the horse's immense radiant body heat to melt the snow into drinking water. She tore open the remaining feed sacks with her teeth, scattering oats for the chickens and pulling handfuls of hay for the goats. On what she guessed was the 12th day of the storm, the shivering stopped. Sarah woke up, and the oppressive, crushing heat in her blood was gone. She felt hollowed out, weak as a newborn kitten, but the deep, throbbing agony in her leg had localized. The red streaks traveling up her thigh had faded to a bruised purple. The horse-grade penicillin had brutalized her stomach, leaving her violently nauseous, but it had slaughtered the infection. She sat up, leaning her head against the wooden support post. The air in the trench had changed. The damp, freezing chill had been replaced by a heavy, stale humidity. And then she heard it. The silence above them was no longer absolute. The screaming wind had vanished. In its place, filtering down through 12 feet of compacted snow and corrugated steel, came the faint, rhythmic sound of dripping water. The temperature outside was rising. Sheriff Sullivan Miller stood awkwardly on the vibrating exterior tread of the massive, county-owned snowcat, pulling his heavy polarized sunglasses down over his wind-burned eyes. The glare, reflecting off the unbroken, blinding white landscape, was physically agonizing, a cruel and mocking contrast to the 14 days of suffocating darkness they had just endured. It was day 14 of the crisis. The historic freak blizzard had dumped an official, staggering total of 14.5 feet of snow on the Bitterroot Divide, effectively erasing the rugged topography of the entire county. Now, a high-pressure system had finally moved in, bringing a brilliantly clear azure sky and a rapid temperature spike into the upper 30s. The thaw had begun, but for many, it was far too late. Inside the heated cab of the snowcat, Caleb Foster sat in the passenger seat, his face a pale, grim mask of dread that aged him a decade. The heavy machine roared, its massive metal tracks chewing through the deep, wet powder, carving a fresh, jagged path right over the top of where Ridge Creek Road used to be. It had taken the county rescue teams 3 exhausting, sleepless days just to clear the main highways and untangle the gridlock of abandoned vehicles. Now, they were doing the grim, solitary work of performing welfare checks on the remote off-grid properties nestled deep in the mountains. Nobody in the cab of that snowcat expected to find Sarah Jenkins alive. "That's the property line," Caleb pointed, his voice tight and hoarse, tapping a thick, calloused finger against the frosted glass. "The cabin should be about a quarter-mile up that ridge. Or, at least, what's left of it." The snowcat lumbered over the crest of the ridge, and Miller signaled the driver to cut the massive diesel engine. As the mechanical roar died away, the heavy, morbid silence of the mountain rushed back in, broken only by the sound of melting snow dripping from the pines. Caleb swore softly, a prayer and a curse tangled together under his breath. Sarah's 70-acre property was entirely unrecognizable. The massive 2-story barn, a structure that had stood for nearly a century, was simply gone. In its place was a jagged, rolling mound of white, with only the violently splintered ends of a few heavy timber support beams poking through the crust like broken ribs. The log cabin itself was buried all the way to the eaves. Only the stone chimney and the very peak of the cedar-shingled roof were visible above the suffocating ocean of snow. "Grab the avalanche shovels," Miller ordered his deputy, a broad-shouldered young man named Wyatt Campbell, who was sitting in the rear jump seat looking vaguely sick. "We dig straight down to the front porch." The 3 men strapped on their aluminum snowshoes and trudged through the deep, slushy powder toward the buried cabin. The silence hanging over the property was heavy and absolute. They began digging at the front of the structure, relying on Caleb's memory of the layout. It took them an hour of backbreaking, sweat-soaked labor to carve a narrow, highly unstable vertical shaft down through 12 feet of packed snow to reach the front door. Miller drew his heavy police-issue maglite, his stomach tying into a familiar, cold knot. He pushed against the thick oak door. It wasn't locked. It had merely been wedged shut by the immense pressure of the snowpack. He shoved it open, stepping out of the bright Montana sun and into the freezing, pitch-black interior. "Sarah!" Caleb yelled, his voice echoing sharply in the dead, frigid air. "Sarah Jenkins! Are you in here?" Nothing. The cabin was a frozen tomb. A thick, glittering layer of hoarfrost coated the log walls, the fabric of the furniture, and the dead cast-iron wood stove. The temperature inside was well below freezing, preserving the space in a terrifying stillness. Deputy Campbell swept the mudroom with his flashlight, his beam cutting through the floating dust motes. "Sheriff," Wyatt called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Look at the floor." Miller and Caleb hurried over, their boots crunching on the frosted hardwood. There, stark and black against the pale wood, were a series of dark, smeared stains. They were thick, rust-colored, and trailed erratically across the room. Blood, and a lot of it. "She was badly injured," Miller said grimly, tracking the macabre trail. "It didn't lead toward the kitchen, where the first aid supplies might be, or toward the bedrooms, to die in comfort. It led directly to the center of the mudroom floor, stopping abruptly where a heavy oak workbench had been pushed haphazardly into the corner. Where the bench had previously sat, a perfect square was cut into the floorboards. A heavy, hand-forged iron ring sat flush against the wood. "What in God's name is that?" Caleb whispered, stepping forward, his mind struggling to process the architecture. He grabbed the iron ring with both hands, planted his boots, and heaved upward. The trapdoor, swollen tight with freezing temperatures and deep moisture, resisted stubbornly for a second before popping open with a loud, shrieking groan of wood against wood. A wave of warm, impossibly foul air blasted up from the dark, square void. It was a sensory assault, smelling intensely of wet earth, raw sewage, rotting hay, animal sweat, and the sharp, coppery tang of infection. Miller immediately shone his high-powered flashlight down the hole. The beam illuminated a crude wooden ladder descending into a narrow, timber-lined tunnel that stretched out into the darkness. And there, sitting calmly at the bottom of the ladder, staring up at the blinding beam of light, was a single, ruffled Rhode Island red chicken. "Hello?" The voice that drifted up from the subterranean darkness was so weak, so desperately raspy and raw, it sounded like a ghost caught in the earth. Caleb dropped to his knees, ignoring the freezing wood biting through his jeans. "Sarah? Sarah? Is that you?" Down in the muddy, ruined trench, Sarah shielded her eyes against the painful beam of the sheriff's flashlight. She was a horrifying sight. She was covered head to toe in a thick paste of Montana clay, dried blood, and animal filth. Her face was hollowed out, her cheekbones sharp from starvation. But her eyes were fiercely, violently alive. "Caleb," she coughed, her cracked, bleeding lips forming a painful, exhausted smile. "You're late for coffee." The subsequent rescue operation took another 4 agonizing hours. Wyatt Campbell immediately radioed for a specialized heavy-lift extraction team and a flight medic to be brought up by a second snowcat. They couldn't simply pull Sarah up the narrow, vertical wooden ladder. Her leg was too heavily damaged, and the slightest bump could send her into shock. Instead, the team had to use the snowcats to carefully excavate the snowpack from the center of the yard, exposing the corrugated steel roof of the buried trench from above. When they finally cut through the heavy steel panels with a plasma torch and lifted her out of the muddy hole in a rigid Stokes basket, the lead paramedic, a seasoned trauma specialist named Jody Dawson, was absolutely stunned. Her core temp is hovering at 97, Jody reported, wide-eyed, rapidly wrapping Sarah in multiple heated mylar blankets as they loaded her into the back of the idling medical snowcat. She's severely dehydrated, malnourished, and she's got a massive, deep tissue laceration on her right calf that should have killed her 3 days ago. But, Sheriff, look at these vials we found down there. She pumped herself full of heavy-duty veterinary penicillin. She essentially cured her own advanced sepsis while buried in a dirt hole. Caleb stood by the jagged edge of the exposed trench, watching the rescue team rig a massive, reinforced canvas sling to hoist Buster the draft horse out of the subterranean tunnel. The 2,000-pound animal was exhausted but miraculously unbroken. The 3 goats were already up on the surface, greedily devouring fresh alfalfa hay from the back of the county truck. He walked slowly over to the medical stretcher just before they closed the heavy doors of the snowcat. He looked down at Sarah. Her face was pale beneath the layers of grime, an IV line already pumping warm saline and human-grade antibiotics into her bruised arm. "Bill Harrison," Caleb said quietly, taking off his Stetson and turning it in his hands, his voice thick with a mixture of profound shame and absolute awe. "You listened to that crazy old man at the hardware store when I told you to ignore him." Sarah turned her head slightly on the pillow, looking past Caleb at the deep, jagged, muddy scar she had carved into the frozen earth of her front yard. "He wasn't crazy, Caleb," she whispered, her eyes fluttering shut as the heavy dose of intravenous painkillers finally began to pull her under into a deep, safe sleep. "He just remembered how fast the world can disappear." The winter of that year went down in the Bitterroot County archives as a lethal anomaly, a storm that claimed livestock, property, and the lives of those caught unprepared. But on the off-grid property at Ridge Creek, it became a testament to human endurance. The trench between the cabin and the barn was eventually filled in. The earth smoothed over and reseeded with wild grass the following spring. Yet, the invisible scar remained, a permanent reminder of the fragile line between life and absolute zero. Sarah Jenkins survived, not through luck, but through the primal, exhausting refusal to surrender to the cold. She paid for her survival in blood, in the terror of the dark, and in a profound understanding of her own resilience. The earth had threatened to bury her, but instead, it had become her shield, proving that sometimes salvation requires digging deep